This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the Peter Principle, half a century on. Is it still relevant or not? I will be speaking with Alan Benson about that. The subject is the Peter Principle. It is a concept that first came about in the late 1960s and has been somewhat of a bane for some organizations, especially in the corporate world. I'm speaking with Alan Benson, and as I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a chance to introduce themselves. So Alan, welcome. If you could tell a little bit about yourself, your background in business and or economics, and opening volleys about the Peter Principle.
Great, yeah, and thanks, Dan, for having me. A bit about myself. So I went through Cornell's Industrial and Labor Relations School, which is kind of like a program where people study organizations from multiple different disciplines, including economics. That's really where I got my bug for economics. And then I went to MIT for my PhD at the business school, where I was doing work with both with economists and also with people who are studying organizations, again, from multiple disciplines. I think a lot of my interest in this kind of work really came from an interest in kind of what was oftentimes being called in industry people analytics. So using the tools of like data science, but also to study people issues. And I guess being around MIT and all the people who are just kind of interested in technology, but also having a great business school and economics department, I was interested in using a lot of those techniques to study organizations myself. I also liked to kind of rub shoulders more with folks in industry, and a lot of my work, is working with companies' data. And when I was attending a conference, kind of presenting with one of the companies I was working with, I heard this adage that the best salespeople don't necessarily make the best managers. And that's where I thought, gee, I should do a research project that really tested this directly. And so really for me, the Peter Principle was really a culmination of my interest in background in economics and in management research, and also what I saw as really a phenomenon that really kept coming across during my work with companies.
So for those who don't know, if you could just give a little summary of who Peter was and what the Peter Principle, the book, was, and its impact over 50 years ago.
Yeah. So even if you've heard of the Peter Principle, you might not have known really like who is this Peter fellow. The Peter Principle came from also an academic, Lawrence Peter, but Lawrence Peter wasn't necessarily interested in the study of organizations per se. I think he was just kind of he was putting on his social science hat to study an observation about organizations, which is that people seem to get promoted because they're good at their job, and they keep on getting promoted because they're good at their job until they land in a job they're not good at, and then they get stuck there. And so sometimes you'll hear that the statement of the Peter Principle is that people rise in an organization, people rise to their level of incompetence. And the book was published in 1969 with it was Peter and Raymond, or Raymond Hall, Lawrence Peter and Raymond Hall, and they. I think it was really meant to be like it was meant to be like a not a serious book, it was, or meant to be a satirical book. The first chapters of the Peter Principle were really laid out kind of the main argument that I just described, and so like isn't this funny that like you get like these great people who are great at the factory floor and they become horrible foremen, or you have this great doctor and they are tapped to lead a hospital despite being about having no particular skills in leadership. And then the rest of the book, really, most of it is really a set of really observations that go from bizarre but also the thought-provoking. And it's really quite unlike anything that I as an academic has read. And that, a lot of our work, we're really trying to dig into the basic, we have our roots in the basic theories of economics and trying to apply statistical methods to study those things. And here was this book also by an academic, but with no particular training along those lines, and saying, isn't this a peculiar observation? Isn't this how organizations work? And I think, there's actually a lot of merit to even just that refreshing approach and some of the observations that they pull out in that original book.
So before we sort of dig through some of the main theses the book proposes, you mentioned how it was written sort of satirically. Now, it does make use of nonsense names. It's not like it's saying Joe Smith, who ran the XYZ company or corporation, and does it. Was the book originally intended, because Raymond Hull, as I recall and in reading up, was someone who was sort of a writer for hire. He himself did not know anything about this principle, this idea, gag or not, that Peter had come up with. He was hired just to write the text that Peter, I guess, wasn't good at. So does the book have anything in common with something like Catch-22, the novel by Joseph Heller, which was a satire on the military?
Right. It's been a long time since I've read Catch-22, I admit. But right, it does, so yeah, Raymond Hall, I've seen this too with like Freakonomics. Freakonomics is another like popular book, written by an academic, Stephen Levitt, who's a very serious behavioral economist. And also written and then also co-authored with a journalist who's very good at taking these academic ideas and also making them more relatable. It's really hard to tell, reading the Peter Principle for me, how much is perhaps like Lawrence Peters, again, the academics, kind of snarky view on life versus what is kind of kind of the marketing of attaching funny names to everything. Like there's this term percussive sublimation where this idea that we need to like drum an organization just to shake things up every now and then, so that to get people to move, so they don't cause too much damage wherever they're situated. So it's and so a lot of those ideas didn't necessarily becomes popularized as the basic statement of the Peter Principle, but at the same time, we saw, I think we see this kind of funny marriage between an academic and a kind of a journalist, pop up to some success in a lot of situations, perhaps here as well.
What do you think was the cultural milieu that allowed the book to be successful? Because during that time, there were lots of I guess you call guru kind of ideas. Marshall McLuhan was big in the late 60s.
Right.
Alvin Toffler wrote Future Shock, which people have debated for decades since. Do you think that the book itself was a product of the 60s, or if it had never been written, but was written, say, in 2019, 50 years on, do you think it would have had the same effect, especially considering now when we're looking at global warming and the effects of runaway capitalism and corporatism?
Right. I really want to almost get your perspective on it. I mean, are books reflections of society, or society also reflections of some of the art that comes out of it? I think economically what was going on in the 1960s was what academics like to call like the internal labor markets, where organizations were hiring people at lower level jobs and port of entry, and then they were developing them from within. And you could spend your entire career at a company like General Electric or any of these other large conglomerates and work your way up from the very bottom and along predictable pathways. And I really think this is, really the kind of environment where an idea like the Peter Principle really thrived. Maybe it's no coincidence that maybe that was the environment where Dilbert also thrived. It's like people are familiar with kind of the office the the ebbs and flows of like office politics, and they were observing how like people were coming in at lower level jobs, but not necessarily being successful or well placed to where their careers kind of took them. Um, Not because, and it wasn't necessarily because they wanted their careers to go that way, but that was because kind of the ladder, where the ladder goes.
The book itself, putting aside the ideas within, it reminds me of several things in the arts where works that were not really serious somehow became serious. I forget the name of the book, but in the 1950s, a rock and roll, then rock and roll radio station promoted this book in New York, which was sort of like what would now be called softcore porn, or it was like a bad romance novel, and someone, I forget who it was, wrote then the book that was promoted because people were going to bookstores to demand to see it. And then you've also had, for example, painters who would paint fake Picassos or fake this or that, and they would then be accepted by the experts as real Picassos or real Manets. And I also think
Mhm.
too of a few hoaxes that were done in the poetry world where people just made the most ridiculous types of verse, and some experts were declaiming it genius, better than real poets at the time. Was there an element, do you think, of Peter and Hull and the publisher just trying to get something over on people who would write all of these dense books about labor theory and economics?
That's a great question, and I don't think that was their goal.
No.
And I don't necessarily think the audience for that book was necessarily academics who studied that. The academic world, the world of economists who are studying organizations is pretty thin in the 1960s. And in fact, really, for one reason or another, um, largely like economists are more focused on markets per se, rather than like what was going on inside of organizations. And really, it was in the 1980s where economists started to study organizations more and say, you know what, like organizations themselves are actually interesting. Think about as economics as being about the production and distribution of resources, and that is, in an organization we still have those same problems. It's just that we don't really have prices and competition necessarily within the price competition within an organization to decide, whether we do something or not. Um, so and so I think we were pretty late to studying organizations, and it really wasn't until I think the first mention of the Peter Principle in an economics work that I know of was in 1992. So remember, the original book was in 1969, and in 1992, there's a paper by George Baker and Kevin Murphy that says, oh, like, by the way, we all know that like the best salesperson doesn't necessarily make the best sales manager, right? Or the best academic doesn't necessarily make the best dean. Um, but that was kind of a contra. I think even back then, people didn't really know what the Peter Principle was, and some probably didn't believe it. I think then I think the most serious and well-known academic treatment then came in 2004, where the most famous economist who's studying organizations, Eddie Lazier at Stanford, who is really the economist who I think really kicked off like people's interest in the economics of organizations. He said like he just didn't think it existed. I was worried when we were writing this paper that, oh wait, there's already this other paper on the Peter Principle and by this like super famous economist, and it's like, oh great, this article is about how it doesn't exist. So his belief is that, hey, organizations take like the best salesperson, for example, and then they promote them to become a manager, and then they might not make a great manager, but that great salesperson is still the organization's best guess as to who a successful manager would be. And so you can't necessarily fault what we call statistical mean reversion, taking someone who's great at something, and then they change the context and they become really good at something. Kind of the same way how like in a movie or a book or whatever, the original is the best, and then when the sequel, was only made because the original was so good, but on average the sequel might not be as good, as amazing as the first one that spawned the series. And so he thought the same thing was happening in organizations and promotions as well.
So I do want to get to your study with Shu and Lee a bit later once we talk about the premises of the book. But a couple of other points here just to wrap up this first section. In the intervening decades, about 10, 12, 15 years ago, I guess it was, maybe even in the early O's, there came what to be known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that people who are dumb often don't realize they are dumb. And having worked many years in and out of corporate world, mostly though in corporations, do you now see a sort of a latter-day connection between perhaps the Dunning-Kruger effect and the promoting of people to their level of incompetence?
Right. Yeah. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is, really more well known in psychology, but I think maybe it's underappreciated also, among economists. But it's this idea that if you're really incompetent, if you're really bad at something, you're so bad you don't even know what good looks like, and so when you do a bad job, you can't even tell the difference. I think some of that could very well be the case with managers too. If you have, say, like a great engineer, for example, and that great engineer becomes very confident in their abilities because of their success as an engineer, because of success in one domain, and then they go to something completely different, and especially something where we don't necessarily have the best feedback or the best performance measures as management. They might go into that position and just not realize how they are detracting from their team, or even how or they might even blame others for what seem for their own inadequacies in that domain. I think we have like a tendency to to assume that if we've been successful, and then we've been all of a sudden not successful, you might attribute that to like, oh, this isn't about me or about my change in roles, but it's about the people, the people who others. And so I can certainly see how the Dunning-Kruger effect could relate to the Peter principle as well.
Finally, to end this section, about 20 years ago, around the turn of the century, I worked for about 5.5 years at AT&T, where I think Scott Adams also worked at Dilbert, that you mentioned. And one of the things that I don't recall if it's mentioned in the Peter Principle itself is not only promoting of incompetence from within, but certainly in the last 25 years, we've seen more when companies buy out other companies, you get people who are from company A put into positions within company B that are incompatible. I'll give you a good example at AT&T. In the late 1990s, when the baby bells when Ma Bell had been broken up, in the 1980s, the baby bells were 5 or 6 regional carriers of local calls, and AT&T itself was long distance. And they then started re-merging and reforming, and now you just got maybe AT&T and maybe one or two others, Verizon, the remnants of the Bell system. But in the late 90s, Comcast was bought out by AT&T, Comcast, the cable company, and its then CEO, Michael Armstrong, was then, as part of the deal, promoted to the CEO of the combined Comcast AT&T. This is as AT&T wanted to get into the cable TV business, which it has, but it became so obvious within a few months that a guy who knew about cable TV, assuming he did, knew nothing about even the basics of the business of running a telecom. And I remember every month me and the people who worked in my organization, part of the organization of the company, we were doing collections, would we get the monthly summary of stuff, and we'd say, oh, that's a bad decision, that's a good decision. Every month we'd pick one. And my team of about 15 people, after about 16 months, I think we were right on 13 decisions out of 16, and Armstrong was right on 3 of 16. And we were like, how is it that we, who probably make 1/100th that this guy does, know this business better than he does? So my question relating back to the book is, do you think that is something that uh, is a corollary to the Peter principle that would probably be dealt with, how people from outside organizations supersede everyone and are even worse than someone who might be promoted from within?
Absolutely. And there's actually really good evidence on that too. There's a researcher at Harvard Business School, Boris Groysberg, who studies if you take someone like a star from one organization and you put them in a new team, like oftentimes for whatever reason, maybe it's because of their networks, because of they were just the right person for the right position, the right person for that other situation or that knowledge domain. Yeah, they don't succeed. They end up, the organizations tend to, mentioned 1/100th of the pay. They tend to say, let's pay this person a ton of money to attract them away.
Yeah.
And then, but you put them in a situation that, you're not really buying what you paid for. You're buying someone who is excellent in this one area and expecting them to just import that over necessarily somewhere else and in a very different situation. And so, so I think this is, another great example of the Peter principle in action.
Thus was born the golden parachute.
That's well, yeah. So so we need so exactly. Well, that might be the insurance policy against the Peter principle.
So, Alan, let's talk about the book itself, and then after we go through some of the examples the book gives, we'll give some other examples from your study, other things from my own work experience, etc. But what is one of the first or most archetypal situations of the Peter principle? We've talked about corporations, but it doesn't always apply just to corporations. It can be any kind of hierarchical organization. And what is hierarchy have to do with the Peter principle?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think really, I guess a more general statement of the Peter principle was you take somebody from someone who succeeded in one domain, you put them in a different situation, and the skills and the abilities and the motivation and drive that made them so successful in that old domain don't necessarily map over to the new one. And so I think you can see how naturally this would apply in organizations. How you would take somebody who might be a successful engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, and then you put them into something that could be very different, which is leading a group of people performing those activities. And then they don't necessarily succeed, given that the skills required of a manager aren't necessarily related to programming or to diagnosing illnesses or to producing legal arguments and so on. And so, so I think it's really more of a general phenomenon than necessarily what you would just see in promotions.
Now, I mentioned the golden parachute. Peter also comes up with a couple of ways that, at least back then, people who were risen to their level of incompetence are sort of shoehorned or dead-ended into jobs. You're executive vice president in charge of pencil sharpeners or something. Talk about how companies would then deal with this in their view.
It's really difficult for me to say, because I think still a lot of this could be based on our own observations, and I think that's one of the beauties of the original book and the examples, like the executive vice president of the pencil sharpeners. But I think it's I feel like we have these instances where somebody who was promoted, they weren't successful in that role. I think there's the sense that, well, maybe we found the wrong position for them. Now we have to move them. And so maybe like another position was created that, might think that looks more similar to their old one, but they can't go back to the old one per se because might be seen as a demotion. And so you have these more peculiar, tailored roles that are created. And so, yeah, I think but I think, maybe to their original point, sometimes these positions could be seen as like, it's more like containing the decisions and the damage that could be done. I think that's kind of the premise of that of the book.
Yeah, you mentioned demotions. It seems imminent in the book's claims, whether satirical or not, that ego plays a large part in the failures of the individual workers as well as the organization itself. That organizations that get too hubristic with either internally or in facing outward competition in whatever area they're in, that this also plays a part. What is the role of the human ego and hubris in this whole idea of Peter's?
I think that there's certainly the sense that that organizations should establish ladders because ladders are fundamentally motivating. There is a lot of evidence that promotions in and of themselves do a lot more than just simply confer greater pay or even responsibilities. They are a way to motivate people to climb, to feel like they're getting a sense of advancement. And even, the carrot on the end of the stick, the possibility that, if you stay, if you succeed, you'll be promoted into like a new role. Like that is kind of a way that organizations really motivate and get people to work harder and to be successful at their jobs. And so what that really comes into an issue like demotions, because there's a sense that if you go from, for example, an individual contributor into a leadership position and then back again, it could be seen as you have fewer reports, or you're going back to somehow moving backward in your career. And I think it's also, there's this social sense that it's a mark of failure. But I would argue that that's partially a feature of organizations' own making. They've set up these ladders for people to climb, and they've said, hey, you should work hard for that promotion. And we've been doing that instead of really normalizing the possibility that as you change roles, you can contribute to the organization in different ways. And if you are happier, or if you get something out of a position that that could be more of an individual contributor role as opposed to a management role, that should be fine. And some organizations really do try to, have their cake and eat it too, by establishing like multiple different ladders and like a sense that, it's okay, you can go up the leadership track, but there'll still be like an individual contributor track that you might be able to, transition to or move into if you and you'll still have that same pay and prestige as the people in that other track. But in practice, that's actually very difficult to implement as well.
One of the things that I read in a few articles, leafing through a few dozen over the last couple of weeks, in regards to the book and its time and place of publication, was that the book itself had some failings in that it didn't particularly deal, at least in the original text, maybe in later editions it didn't deal with racism or sexism. Basically, this was organizations where the assumption was these were all straight white males. Is there any truth to that take on the book, and does that sort of give more credence to the idea that this was a satire rather than a real operating principle?
Yeah, I think this is a product of 1969, and I feel like this is the this is this piece of me, reading the satire from the period where it just looks like relatively a homogenous organization of people probably wearing crisp suits and ties, and really not. And yeah, I think it's missing a lot of the really yeah, a lot of issues that are so important today, racism, sexism in the workplace, Me Too movement, and just the list of, I think, the most important things that we see in organizations, and moreover, I think there are really important connections between. I think some of and the reason why I think this is so consequential is that some of the ways that organizations try to address the Peter Principle, for example, performance evaluation systems where people will be rated on their performance and their potential. Now that seems like a great solution to the Peter Principle problem. It's like, hey, look, you have this person who's a great individual contributor, rate them as a high performer who has, maybe lower potential. And so we'll reward them within their own role, but we won't necessarily move them into more of a leadership position. What my co-authors and I are finding is that those sort of evaluation systems are very biased, particularly against women. Women are much more likely to be rated as high performers, but low potential for future promotion. And so kind of one of the solutions of the Peter Principle has become, I think, a process that has also led to the glass ceiling effect, fewer women being recognized and rewarded for their potential as leaders.
And of course, the people making the promotions themselves may have been promoted to a level of incompetence where they don't even know to be able to differentiate who has the potential truly and who doesn't.
Yes, exactly. And I think even the more concerning is, they might, if you take like a senior male manager, you might have a certain leadership stereotype that could be, straight from like Mad Men or something, or from, leader is someone who is agentic and assertive and, makes the tough calls or whatever, and really might not recognize broader leadership styles. They're looking to maybe reproduce something that looks more like themselves. And absolutely, they're like, they might not even, maybe this is going back to Dunning-Kruger, they might not realize that what they look like isn't necessarily the way, isn't necessarily the only way to do things, or even a particularly good way of doing things.
I want to talk about the concepts of super incompetence and super competence. And I think back to a boss that I had some years back who was a very competent manager in retail. And what often happened was, because he was so good at what he did, he was given other people to train, and these people eventually were raised to levels beyond him, even though they were not as good as he at the particular job. So what does the book tell you about super incompetence and super competence?
Right. Well, I think that that oftentimes, so one of the issues that's related to the principle is this, the Peter Principle is this issue of talent hoarding, whereby some managers might identify some really talented subordinate, but then fail to recognize them and otherwise get them to other positions, and to train and develop, and get them onto bigger and better things. Now, suppose you have one of these, you say super confident managers who are amazing at developing subordinates and getting them to go up in their careers, maybe even surpassing their own. That could be a real, that could be a real issue, because oftentimes organizations might not necessarily, track or reward, those kinds of activities, given, or at least not as much as recognizing them for how important those activities really are. Imagine you have an organization where they tell managers, oh, you should be developing your subordinates. And the manager does a great job of developing their subordinates, so much so that their subordinates go on to a different team and end up, perhaps even surpassing them. And really, this was, what's funny is, back in the 1960s and the post-war period, like organizations, that is the reason why they had these really predictable ladders. They said, well, look, if you have a predictable ladder where you get promoted to, say, your boss's job, then, and it takes you a certain number of years, regardless of how competent you are, or regardless of how good you are at your job. Well, then in that case, managers won't feel threatened by recruiting and developing star subordinates, because they'll because those pathways are so predictable, they're not ever going to have to necessarily, they're not at risk of like losing them and ultimately having their subordinates surpass them, for example.
The book also mentions pathways that can be blocked by seniority, and the very concept of seniority is more linked with organized labor, unionism, which was more of a factor back 50 years ago, when I think something like 20 plus to 30% maybe of the workforce was unionized. Now it's 7 or 8% or whatever it might be. What was the book's take upon unionism and organized labor, if any?
Yeah, so the book more focuses on like white collar labor, but does have some examples from more blue collar work, like the foreman at the factory floor, for example, where you have someone who's a great machine operator who becomes a bad foreman. I think regardless of, obviously in organized settings, they tend to want to negotiate so that pay is determined entirely by seniority. And part of that is also to take some of the discretions away from management, but also, even in the absence of an organized setting, it used to be that organizations put more emphasis on seniority when it came to decisions like promotions. I think these days maybe what's more common is that so-called market-based approach, where there's internal job postings and then anybody at the organization can apply for any role, and if they are at least minimally qualified, then perhaps someone will at least take a look at their application. But it's a lot more fluid, and they'll be competing against presumably external candidates as well, which wasn't always the case.
In this early part of the 21st century, one of the things that with a lot of job applications, especially in white collar work, you get employees who have to go through a battery of tests where they really ask some of the dumbest kinds of questions. Well, if you were in this situation, would you do this, that, or the other thing, and why? That was really almost non-existent, if not maybe the dawn of that kind of thinking within corporations 50 plus years ago. This might be outside the purview of the book, but in your studying it and your own studies, how do you think the Peter Principle applies to things like that, the testing, the aptitude?
Right. So, we call these like behavioral type interviews or behavioral interviews. They say, confronted with, so like in retail, you mentioned retail, like one example might be, you observe, a colleague taking something from the store that they shouldn't be taking out of the store. What do you do? Or tell me about a time that you dealt with a frustrated customer. I think that my understanding is that from like organizational psychologists who study those kinds of methods, they tend to be the most, at least like the best predictors, given that past success in a similar role is a good predictor of success in a future role, if those roles are similar to each other. And I think, we see this in our data too. The best predictor of future success in the same job is past success in the same job. But really the challenge is that is when we see someone who is successful in a job that was very different than the job that they would be going into. In that case, you really don't have great data. And past success isn't necessarily a great predictor of future success. And that's one of the things that we are finding when we're looking at salespeople, is that past success as a salesperson actually isn't a very good predictor of future success as a manager.
But that's also like the book has the equation: incompetence plus incompetence equals incompetence, where you could have someone who's an incompetent manager and say, well, Jones, he knows what he's doing. Maybe we put him there as the assistant and help it. And instead of Jones ameliorating his superior, the superior spoils Jones.
Right. Unfortunately, there's so many different ways, I think, to be to be an incompetent manager. And so one of the challenges with, or for example, like a sales manager, is that you don't just need knowledge as like a salesperson, but you need to be able to understand data and how to motivate other people and how to really like compile information and train and develop people. And these aren't, just because you're successful in one area doesn't necessarily mean you're successful in all. I think this is why, like in a business school, or myself and my co-authors are teaching, we don't just teach necessarily in our own area, but we try to get them exposure to to real world opportunities and to training in marketing and organizational behavior and finance and so on, because they're not necessarily exposed to as individual contributors who are focusing on expertise in kind of one more narrow domain.
So I want to ask a final question regarding the actual book here, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the things you may have found in studying it further, and also some other examples I'll toss out. But the book also ends with this conclusion, which some have also thought was sort of satirical, about human beings as a species reaching their level of incompetence. And now you look 50 plus years down the line, and well, let's see, you have people who, despite 150 years of evidence, oh, there's no global warming, despite constant records in heat, larger storms, worse this, that, and the other thing, larger floods. You have people who seriously or semi-seriously now are still arguing on the internet that the earth is flat. We're on the verge possibly here of the overturning of a woman's right to abortion. 50 years on from the civil rights movement, or more, 60 years on, and there are people who are actively conspiring to take away the right to vote for people of color, and on and on and on. I could give further examples of how it seems that in the year 2022, as we record, people seem to be even dumber than they were 50-some years ago. So the book's conclusion that the Peter Principle might work outside of organizations and apply to our species as a whole might have been written with tongue-in-cheek then, but do you think that there might be some actual evidence towards it as a segue into your own studies?
I like the word tongue-in-cheek. Yeah, it's as much of a satire as this was, or a joke, I think they were, I think Lawrence Peter is very serious, and that if we look at kind of the social ills, probably even of his day, we are taking people who are celebrated in one area, whether it's, say, business or whatever, and saying that someone who's going to be successful in that domain should be made to make decisions about something like reproductive rights, or people make everybody seems to be an expert on Twitter about this that's going on in the Supreme Court or the economy or whatever. It's and I think if and yes, I think maybe part of one of our one of the failings of an organization is to take people who are successful in one domain and radically change their positions and expect them to succeed. Maybe one of our failings as a society is to take someone who is very successful in their area of expertise and really give them a platform and give them real power over something that maybe requires more nuance. And it really requires, people who've really dedicated a lot of time and effort, and a community really who's dedicated a lot of time and effort to understanding something and what's worked in the past.
Alan, I contacted you because in Googling about regarding the Peter Principle, you mentioned Lazia, but yours and your two co-authors had done a study following up on the Peter Principle. Can you tell me a little bit about your two co-authors, your studies, what it was intended and what it found out?
Right. So as I mentioned, when I was working on salespeople, then I was looking at how sales managers game the incentives of their subordinates. I was presenting some of that work at industry conferences, and I really noticed that there was someone who was talking about how just mentioned it off the, kind of off the cuff that, salespeople tend to make the best salespeople tend to make the worst managers, but we promote them anyway. And then everyone kind of laughed and nodded their heads. They said, gee, like that's one of the first times that I've heard that, I should look into it. And so Danielle Lee and I were friends from graduate school. We were both, our doctoral advisor was, we shared the same doctoral advisor, which in the academic world kind of makes us academic siblings in a sense. But she was interested in how organizations make decisions about people and ideas and things. For example, what types of projects to fund, what type of people to who to hire, things like that. And I told her, look, we have you heard about this thing called the Peter Principle? And even though my co-author Danielle is brilliant, but and maybe to our credit, she hadn't heard of the Peter Principle up until that point. And but I think we agreed that this would be a fantastic thing to actually test in some of these large scale sales data that I had. And then Kelly Hsu, our third co-author in the paper, was a friend of Danielle's over at Harvard, and so we were. Danielle and I were at MIT. She was a PhD student at Harvard. We went off to after we graduated to become faculty members at Northwestern's Kellogg School, and then Chicago, and then myself in Minnesota. And we started to work on this paper, and really the data, we had these great data to really look at it, which is we had data from a company that administers sales performance management software over the cloud, meaning that there are companies that subscribe to the software. They, if you think about it like what would a good example be? Like almost like a, this is like a corporate enterprise software. So they have like a, they have a server, and you log in. You have the salespeople can go on a website, and you put all the data. The sales teams can put on all their data, and they can, the salespeople can see how they're doing versus their sales quota, and their managers can see how their team is doing versus their sales quota. And those kind of data are ideal because we can see, well, look, these salespeople were beating their sales targets 3 times over, and then they get promoted. And so then we can see what happens to their sales teams after they get promoted. And so the 3 of us said, look, we can actually test the Peter Principle, and that's kind of what kicked off this big project.
So what was, if there's a number 2 or 3, or what was the general finding, and can you give a specific example of the 2 or 3 maybe findings that you had?
Yeah, so we found, I think at the very highest level, the most shocking thing to us was you take a great salesperson, and there's actually a negative correlation between someone's success as a salesperson and the sales of their team after the person was promoted. We thought it would be really a weak correlation, or maybe like a weak positive correlation, but it was actually negative. The best salespeople actually did make the relatively bad managers at these more than 200 organizations that subscribe to the software that we're using as part of our data collection. And so the best salespeople made the worst managers. Number 2, we found that in our setting, there's actually measures that they could have used instead that would have indicated that those people would have been good managers. So in our data, a lot of salespeople are the only people who are credited on their sales. These are like enterprise salespeople who are typically, you might have a territory manager and a product manager, and someone who does the installations, an account manager who does the renewals. What we found is that the people who put together the most complex deals involving the most other people who also got rewarded on those sales, those were actually the ones who made the best managers. And so it could be the people who weren't like the lone wolves, going out and doing everything themselves, but really more the team players who are able to navigate kind of the complexities of their own organization to implement a relatively complex sale. But that wasn't necessarily rewarded in our case through either their own pay or through promotions. And so that's I think missing out on promoting these top team players is like another big finding. So a third finding is that it's really hard to tell, whether what they were doing is suboptimal, and that's because if you took an organization that had like top team that has like a top salesperson, and you passed over that top salesperson when you promoted them, and so you promoted somebody who was, say, in the middle of the pack. Now they might have made better managers, but you're a lot more likely to lose the top salespeople. And so in that case, I think promotions really serve two purposes. One, they match people to jobs, but they also are the carrot at the end of the stick. They are a way to advance in an organization. And we're kind of told again and again that if you get promotion, that's like something to strive for. And in most organizations, it's associated with a greater salary and more prestige and so on. And so when a top salesperson is passed over for promotion, maybe because they're one of these lone wolves, they tended to lose them. And so maybe even just to retain, that person, they might need to, organizations might feel more of an obligation to promote them so that future salespeople, those who haven't been promoted yet or relatively early, still have that, possibility or still see that promise of being promoted in the future. And so those, I think, are three of the big takeaways for me. That the best salespeople didn't made relatively poor managers, that organizations were missing out on promoting the best team players, and third, that passing over the high performers when it came to promotion decisions could very well lead to higher turnover. And so maybe organizations were still making the right call, even though you have this ridiculous circumstance of promoting great individual contributors to be bad managers.
So that brings to my mind the idea of synergy. If we're dealing with multiple people and not individuals, because individuals are not going to just be 10 individuals in a department and you can grade them all on a 1 to 100 scale. If, for example, your top performer and your worst performer, the difference on a scale of 1 to 100 is that the worst performer, if we use, let's say, the school idea of 65 is passing or failure, the worst performer is at a 50, the top performer is at a 90. You promote the top performer. Was there any idea that the overall grades for the cumulative grade for the department, if you remove that person, instead of sinking just maybe 5 or 10 points overall, that the team sank 20 or 30, and vice versa if the manager, a competent manager, was replaced with an incompetent manager, did that have a negative synergistic effect on the whole team?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the way that we measured. That's the way that we measured whether a manager was good or bad. We looked at the performance of the subordinates, the same individuals under the new manager, and we found that when organizations were promoting the best salespeople, the performance of their subordinates declined versus what they looked like under their prior managers and also under managers who are promoted despite not being the best salespeople.
So let's talk. Let's sort of pull out a little bit from the whole idea of the Peter principle and your take on it, because you have studied other things. So I want to throw a couple of things out. One of the things that I'm not certain if I recall if the book mentions it, but I've often worked at places, and when you talk with other people who worked at a variety of things, businesses, one of the things that people will talk about negatively is that people are promoted or organizations make bad decisions, not based upon what we might call reasonably, reasonably independent data, that you would have things like cronyism or nepotism, where someone who is either close in terms of relation or close in terms of personal relationships with the person, the decision maker at whatever level the decision is being made. what has your take been? Uh, have you studied nepotism, cronyism, and did the book say anything about it?
Yeah, I think this is really kind of one of the fun findings in personnel economics is that, oftentimes when people are paid relatively a straight salary, and they're not provided incentives, people will hire more based on people who uh, are there, based on there's evidence that people hire people of their own similar backgrounds and maybe based on race and other elements of protected status. But then as you shift their pay more toward incentives and you're awarding them based on the performance of the subordinates who are working under them, the people actually start to be more impartial and to reward people and to hire people more based on their productivity because all of a sudden their purse strings are attached to it. There's also like another, there's this an economist, young sport, at Columbia who was doing an experiment where managers were hiring. This is in Africa, where managing people or hiring people on the team, and then there's a big ethnic conflict that broke out. And they found that after the ethnic conflict broke out, these managers were kind of throwing their subordinates under the bus. Who are of different ethnicities, and it's hurting their pay, but it's also hurting the manager's own pay too. And I think it kind of goes to show, like, there's actually evidence that you say that money can't buy friendship or something, but it kind of can. Like if someone's like if someone's if someone's the more like racially biased you are, you might take a pay cut to to it was called taste-based discrimination. You might take a pay cut to indulge that bias. Um, but if, as that cost goes up and up and up, there's evidence that you become less and you behave more and more as if, the cost of being discriminatory or biased could become too high.
Yeah. One of the outliers to that, though, I've read multiple studies, and you probably are familiar with it, about tipping in the service
Mhm.
industry. Whereas in Europe, where there's no tipping, there isn't sort of the blatant I, grubbing for tips by the by the staff, because they will make a conscious or even unconscious decision that, oh, that person looks rich. If I give them better treatment than these other customers, I'm liable to get a better and bigger tip. So is the service industry somehow an outlier from that in terms of tipping and stuff?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So, I hadn't heard about that in particular. I'd be really
There's your
interested
next
if you
study.
could share. Yeah, there we go. But yeah, I could see how, yeah, there's this theory called statistical discrimination, where it's like I don't necessarily know if you're rich, but if you come in and you look like you're, a high schooler and who's going in with a big group, you might think that this group tends not to tip very well versus someone who's on a fancy date. There you recommend the wine and you have good service and ask if they want scallops on the pasta and that actually might be the best way to allocate your time and effort. But right, yeah, no, it all. I think for me, I'm maybe I just have these lenses on, but that seems to all come back to economics and incentives.
What is the effect of, say, the corporate structure or the hierarchical structure that I have found it tends to promote uh, me firstism, in the sense that people will often say, "Oh, the corporations are so much more efficient than governments," where those people at the DMV, they know they've got a job, or whatnot, or they might be with the AFSCME or something, the union. But I've found that while, and I've worked a couple of government jobs, I've worked mostly in private industry, I've worked a few unionized jobs. I found that corporations, generally speaking, do not come close to promoting innovation or whatnot, because if the person who has that great idea is below me, I'm gonna try to make his life hell so that his idea doesn't get out. You get this the individual first rather than the corporation or the society at large first.
Yeah, one of my I think it's a really great insight. And one of the things that really stuck with me when I was a first year PhD student is, there's a sense that I think, when we were with a bunch of economists, and they're saying that, people might behave irrationally, but organizations that are competing in the marketplace, like they must behave rationally in order to successfully compete. And I remember one of my colleagues, PhD students, fellow PhD students, Nathan Hendren, very famous economist, successful economist at Harvard now. He was in consulting and management consulting, and he said, "Man, have you worked with organizations? Like they behave just like one big messed up individual." And then mentioned like several instances where it's like, yeah, it was very similar to what you mentioned. Like the consultants would make a good argument for like spinning out a certain business, and like the reason why it didn't happen is because some manager said, "Well, my pipe didn't shrink, so I'm not going to do that." Um, and so right, so cronyism or like in favoritism, and these corporate jobs can be relatively secure as well. And I think or even advancing could involve making decisions that are politically savvy, but that could mean keeping your mouth shut, if the environment isn't right. And I think, regardless of one um, thinks about unions, I think some of the sentiment about like job security. Actually, a lot of organizations are saying, look, in order to achieve innovation, we need to say that people have some authority to experiment, on the shop floor. We need to have teams that have some degree of autonomy, have some degree of security, and also have some incentives and rewards so that if what they're trying, if what they're doing, if what they try is successful, they are rewarded. And so I think one of the great movements, I think, in management and the really, I think there's great evidence that this is really the most successful way to do things is really to avoid, the super top-down hierarchical way of doing things, and instead say, look, the people who are doing the job might actually know how to do it best. We just need to give them, again, the authority and the autonomy and the security and the incentives to go out and find the way to do it best themselves. And I think some of the best organizations are the ones that can manage that very successfully.
I wanted to also bring up a point. Now, I've worked in a number of different industries, and I've lived for the last 20 years here in Texas, and I've worked in my local area for two different companies in the same field. One is the field leader, and the other is the third or fourth rung down from the top. And while they have generally the same outreach or the same approach rather to life, I found that the two companies tended to do different things due to their position in that hierarchy. And I want to talk about this for a moment. Let me just give you the example. The company that was the top performer in where I worked and in my area was more arrogant. They were more apt to break local laws, especially local health laws and safety laws. And they were more arrogant in dealing with the vendors that supplied them. The company that was more, if not at the bottom of the heap, but more down towards the middle, was not as arrogant in terms of breaking laws, but they were even more gung-ho about doing little things like doing pay for play, being bought off to get the thing because they couldn't compete monetarily straight up with the top dog, so they would make their money under the table kind of thing. Has there ever been a study, for example, of what I guess you would call the PETA principle for corporations or organizations at large, not the individuals within the corporations, but the entities within their own fields, and how certain companies at the top or the bottom or the middle react differently to each other?
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. And I think that's more the rule than the exception. You have large organizations or you have organizations that were incredibly innovative, for example, that had the sense of being like the small player, like the upstart, the underdog, like say like a Netflix or something, and they succeed, and then at that point, they're not necessarily in the mode of like protecting the turf and being the industry leader themselves. Um, those are kind of the typical growing pains of a lot of organizations. So like Microsoft, which was also I think in the 90s was really like would be a great place to really think about the Peter Principle, because they had all of these incredibly talented engineers. They attract, so Bill Gates was very um, focused on attracting the best, technically smartest engineers that they could find, that he could find. In the 90s, these teams were largely built under them. And there are these stories about how a lot of these managers weren't even on speaking terms with their subordinates. And became was a really big shock when like Microsoft recruit from places like IBM and HP and others, where people were more familiar with how to run organizations. And so, you had this upstart, Microsoft, which was successful because they did something so differently. But that didn't necessarily mean they were well poised to be an industry leader. And uh, and I think you see this time and time again as organizations try to really switch modes, from really needing like one type of person early on, and they try to get them through like stock options and like recruiting one type of person. And then later on, they have these growing pains and they try to solidify their market position, and they don't. They have to grapple with going from the mode of the CEO and the founder knows everybody to, gee, we need to have like chief HR officer, and then we need to have like low level managers make these decisions, and we need to have like formal processes, so that we can actually manage a large organization. And regardless of what one thinks about like management, I think with the 20th century is really a story about how people learned how to run large organizations, and kind of the economic consequences that kind of came as we saw um, as we saw organizations from going looking very different in the times of like Henry Ford, to General Motors, and then to what we see today.
Now, it seems to me, and I'm going to use this term conservatism, not in the right wing, left wing political sense, but it seems to me that the Peter Principle and things that we've learned in the decades since, things that you have studied, it seems to me that to choose Darwin as as the forebear here is that uh, change or die, and you have to constantly innovate, because it seems the Peter Principle is based upon the idea of let's be the most conservative. This guy was good at A, he was good at B, therefore he must be good at C, rather than seeing what made that person good at A and B and then not good at C. And it seems to me too that uh, by when organizations get conservative in how they deal with either the outside competition, with the people who supply them, vendors, or with their own people, that it leads to these bad decisions, because there's an arrogance that comes from well, we must have been doing something right because we're in this superior position, either within the company or within the hierarchy of organizations. Would you agree then with my interpretation that conservatism, not in, again, the political sense, but just in the way people deal with people, is not good for organizations or individuals?
I think it could certainly be detrimental to organizations. And just to give kind of one example is, the kind of the conservative approach would be to have, very clear, if you have like a very clear career ladders, and have this, sense that you have to go up to the next rung in order to succeed and to advance in your career, that doesn't really leave an out if you say get promoted and that's not for you. What we really should have are organizations that, you know, that where people could try it, and if they're successful and if they enjoy it and if that's for them, they can stay. And if not, then they can gracefully go back to what they were doing or into like another role that might be, now that we know that, maybe you can do some soul searching and say like, this is really what I liked and what made me successful about my old position, and how we could contribute in this other different way. So I think that's especially true for organizations that do need to be innovative. There's concern that if you are kind of following the mold and not allowing opportunities for experimentation and for trying different things, then you could be stuck in a position where people are relatively static, or not doing what's best for them. And I even see this, I think when we look at like tech company CEOs who are kind of, like you see the tech company CEOs in the news all the time, making these almost prophetic statements and having these create unusual personal brands. And I think part of that is, they almost need to be seen as being someone who's like not conventional, because their organizations need to be adaptable. And so, whereas I think, in an older industry, you mostly want things to go slow and steady. Like I don't want like Elon Musk to like handle my like water utilities, like, but like I'm fine that he's like, I'm comfortable with the idea that like he's trying to like, bring private rockets to space, So, but yeah, I think even just this idea that, we have these, I think, leaders who try to not necessarily, who try to normalize practices that might be seen as not conservative or not within the mold, would be examples of would really a testament to the line of thinking that maybe we shouldn't always we should normalize failure. We should accept that as part of experimentation, as part of how people and organizations grow.
Well, it seems like to me, conservatism adopts a sort of kick the can down the road philosophy. If you look, for example, the battle against smoking, cigarette companies, and how they knew decades before, and instead of just coming right out and saying, this people got cancer, they stalled and stalled. They finally got a judgment against them, and it delayed the problem. We see the same thing with global warming, and in many things, and instead of saying, okay, there is global warming, we can't. There's not just one thing solution. It's not just do this and we'll solve it. There's going to have to be multiple solutions, and as things change, multiple ways that big countries, developed countries like the U.S. or Europe or Japan, have to do things, and other countries that are not, there always seems to be this mindset of just a one-size-fits-all solution, and that to me seems to be one of the major problems that was dealt with, maybe in an unspoken manner, with the Peter Principle.
Yeah, I mean, like, the climate change, it's a collective action problem with different countries needing to bear the private cost for the public good of the planet. There's issues of the time horizon where it might be politically expedient to kick the can down the road. And I think even in organizations, organizations that take a more conservative approach to how they manage people, you're not going to, the most politically expedient person to offer a promotion is the person who performed best at their prior job, especially in a job like sales, where like it's a very clear performance measure. And so it's like, no one's going to blame you for doing that. And there's like, adage, like, no one's going to blame you for hiring, like, McKinsey or whatever. Like, it's just like the most, it's like you do something that seems to be the most like conservative, safest option. And in the case of the Peter Principle, hire the person or promote the person who was the best at their old job, or in the case of some of the solutions, they say like, rating someone on performance potential, promote the person who's rated highest on their potential. But I think in this case, we're seeing that some of those potential solutions also invite their own problems.
Or it
like
has to be
racism
potential
doesn't.
within whatever area you're going to promote them. And you could have someone, like you said, who's a good salesperson, but just doesn't have people skills, or at least not people skills in a lateral way. They may be good selling to
Right.
people outside the organization, but not within the organization.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and
So,
sailing within the organization is pretty important
yeah.
for a manager.
So let me just ask you finally then, other than some of the ideas I may have given you for future studies, what is your next project to be studying within the fields of business, economics, etc.?
Yeah, so our big project is trying to look at how organizations manage around the Peter Principle. So one of our big projects is looking at 9-box, so rating people on high, medium, or low performance, high, medium, low potential. And we're finding that this offers a solution to the Peter Principle problem because people can promote people who are high potential, low performance, but keep rather than those who are rated as low performance, high performance, low potential. But we're finding that this is really coming at the cost of bias because managers are underestimating women's future potential. We're also looking at some different interventions to get people to, particularly women and minorities, to apply for positions that they might not otherwise be aware of. So, in another experiment that we're running, we're working with the company to give job alerts to people, say there's like a leadership position that they appear to meet the qualifications for, and getting that sent out to all people in a certain business unit. And then our interest is to see whether by sending out those job alerts to all people in the whole business unit, we see like a greater proportion of just of women in particular, women and minorities, apply for those positions, maybe because they were just less aware of those kind of opportunities, or that they met the qualifications for those internal postings. And so we're continuing to try to use economics to study organizations and leadership, maybe not something that people usually think of as the domain of economics, but we're interested in again the production and distribution of resources, and I think having good leaders is such an important is such an important mechanism for getting there.
Just as you were speaking, a thought came to me. I forget whether it was Teddy Roosevelt or someone else, probably not Teddy Roosevelt, but some other famous politician once said something to the effect in regards to politicians that the person who seeks political power by that very claim, that very quality, should be disqualified from political
Uh,
power. And so is there almost a catch-22 with leadership, do you think?
uh, I honestly think there could be, and I really think that some people don't realize that they maybe are worried about taking that first step into leadership. They say, "Oh, I don't want to, I don't want to manage people, or I don't necessarily want to give it a shot." But I think if we normalized it, if we got into this routine or this pattern, or thinking that, look, we are at a team or organization, we are going to, we care about innovation. We're going to say you have like 3-year stints in a certain type leadership type role. However you define that, whoever makes sense for the business. It just, it should be, that idea of like trying to cross-train people and trying to make people help people discover what they're good at, and might surprise them. And I think part of that means we have to get around this idea of thinking that you have to get promoted. You have to you can't be a quote unquote demoted. You can't ever manage fewer people as you progress in your career. And I think that's the kind of thinking that really, that conservative thinking, conservative approach that I think stymies organizational innovation.
Well, Alan Benson, thank you for the conversation. I'll link to your university page below this video. It was good speaking with you about it.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I really enjoyed hearing about your own thoughts and experiences as well.